I was sitting at my desk surrounded by textbooks and notes trying to cram for my economics final. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. My parents were out of town for the weekend, so I had the place to myself. I'd been at it for hours and my eyes were starting to blur from staring at graphs and formulas. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. At first, I didn't think much of it. We had a cat who likes to jump on the counters when he thinks no one's watching. I figured he was probably knocking something over again. I tried to focus back on my studies, but the noise persisted. It wasn't the usual sound of my cat exploring. There was a scraping, like something was being moved across the counter. I sighed, thinking I'd have to go shoo him away before he broke something. As I walked down the hallway towards the kitchen, I noticed how dark it was. I hadn't bothered turning on many lights since I'd been cooped up in my room all evening. The shadows seemed longer than usual, and I felt a slight unease creeping up my spine. I reached for the kitchen light switch, and that's when I saw him. There was a man, halfway through our kitchen window. He was big, wearing dark clothes, and he had this look on his face. Surprise, I think, at being caught. For a second, we just stared at each other. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It felt like my brain short-circuited. Then reality hit me like a truck. This wasn't a dream or my imagination. There was a stranger breaking into my house. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly I was running. My feet carried me back down the hallway to my bedroom. I could hear him cursing and the sound of him fully entering the house. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the lock. I pressed my back against the door as if my weight could keep him out. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I remembered my phone was on my desk. I lunged for it, nearly knocking over my chair in the process. I could hear heavy footsteps in the hallway now. He was in the house, moving around. I tried to steady my breathing as I dialed 911, but it felt like my lungs weren't working right. The operator answered, and I tried to explain what was happening. My voice came out as a whisper at first. I was terrified he would hear me. The operator kept telling me to speak up, and I tried, fighting against the fear that was making my throat tight. I gave them my address and explained there was an intruder in the house. They said they were sending officers right away, but it felt like it would take forever. The operator told me to stay on the line and find a safe place to hide. I looked around my room, trying to find somewhere, anywhere that might offer some protection. My closet seemed like the best option. I grabbed my desk chair and wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would buy me some extra time if he tried to get in. As I was moving towards the closet, I heard him. He was right outside my door. The handle jiggled. Then came his voice, low and threatening, telling me to open up. I didn't respond. I just stood there, frozen, phone clutched to my ear. He started pounding on the door. Each thud made me flinch. The chair was shaking and I was sure it wouldn't hold for long. I backed into my closet, pulling the door almost shut. Through the crack, I could see my bedroom door shuddering with each impact. The operator was still talking to me, asking if I was safe, telling me help was on the way. I couldn't find my voice to respond. All I could do was listen to the pounding getting louder and more frantic. Then I heard it. Sirens in the distance. At first I thought I was imagining it, that my brain was making up the sound I so desperately wanted to hear. But they got louder. The intruder heard them too. The pounding on my door stopped. There was a moment of eerie silence. Then I heard rapid footsteps moving away from my door. Things were being knocked over in the living room, the sound of breaking glass. He was trying to get out. The next few minutes were a blur of shouting and more breaking sounds. I stayed in my closet, barely breathing, until I heard a voice calling out, asking if anyone was in the house. Even then, I was too scared to move at first. When I finally opened my bedroom door, there were police officers in the hallway. They looked relieved to see me. One of them explained that they had caught the intruder trying to escape through the back door. He was in custody now. As the adrenaline wore off, I started shaking. The officers asked me some questions, but I was having trouble focusing. I kept looking at the open kitchen window, thinking about how close it had been. If I hadn't gone to check on that noise. The whole incident probably lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Even after the police left and I called my parents to tell them what happened, I couldn't settle down. My economics final seemed trivial now. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. The power went out around 8 p.m. I remember because I was in the middle of microwaving dinner when everything suddenly went dark. At first I thought it was just our house, but a quick look outside showed the whole neighborhood was pitch black. Great, another blackout. We'd been having issues with the grid lately, but this was the first time it had happened while I was home alone. My parents were out of town for the weekend visiting my grandma. They'd asked if I wanted to come, but I'd used the excuse of needing to study for my history test to stay behind. Truth was, I just wanted a couple days to myself. Funny how quickly that backfired. I fumbled around in the dark, trying to remember where we kept the emergency supplies. After stubbing my toe twice and nearly knocking over a vase, I finally found the drawer with the flashlights and candles. The batteries in the flashlight were dead, of course, so candles it was. I lit a few and placed them around the living room. The flickering light cast weird shadows on the walls, making the familiar space feel suddenly alien. I tried to shake off the creepy feeling and focus on what to do next. Food was out, no microwave, no oven. I settled for a peanut butter sandwich and some chips. As I ate, I kept glancing at my phone. The battery was at 40%, and with no way to charge it, I knew I had to be careful. I sent a quick text to my parents letting them know about the power outage, then put it on airplane mode to conserve battery. With nothing else to do, I decided to try and get some studying done. I grabbed my history textbook and notebook, settling onto the couch. The candlelight wasn't great for reading, but it was better than nothing. I propped a candle on the coffee table next to me, close to the curtain so I could see better. I must have dozed off at some point. 1 minute I was reading about the Civil War, the next I was jerking awake, disoriented. Something had woken me up, but I couldn't figure out what. Then I smelled it. Smoke. My eyes snapped to the candle next to me. It had burned down significantly, and to my horror, I saw that the flame was licking at the edge of the curtain. As I watched, frozen, a small flame caught on the fabric and began to spread. I jumped up, knocking my textbook to the floor. No, 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 I muttered, looking around frantically for something to put out the fire. Water. I needed water. I ran to the kitchen, nearly tripping over my own feet in the dark. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet and turned on the faucet, but nothing came out. Of course, no power meant no pump for our well. By the time I got back to the living room, the entire curtain was engulfed in flames. The heat hit me like a wall, and I could feel sweat breaking out on my forehead. I looked around desperately for something, anything to use. My eyes landed on the throw blanket on the back of the couch. I grabbed it and tried to smother the flames, but it was too late. The fire had spread to the wall, and the blanket caught fire too. I backed away, coughing as smoke filled the room. This was bad. This was really, really bad. I needed to get out. I turned to head for the front door, but flames were already licking at the doorframe. The fire was spreading faster than I could have imagined. I ran upstairs hoping to buy myself some time. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a loud crash from below. Something had fallen. A bookshelf, maybe. The thought of all our family photos, all those memories going up in flames, made me feel sick. I went to my bedroom window trying to open it. It was stuck. Of course it was stuck. It hadn't been opened in years. I pounded on it with my fists, then looked around for something heavier. My desk lamp. I grabbed it and smashed it against the window. Once, twice, 3 times before the glass finally shattered. I could hear the fire roaring downstairs now. Smoke was seeping under my bedroom door. I knew I didn't have much time. I cleared the broken glass from the window frame as best I could, then looked down. It was a long drop to the ground, at least 15 feet. But I didn't have a choice. I climbed out onto the roof, the shingles rough under my bare feet. The night air was cool compared to the heat of the house, and for a second, I thought I might be safe out here. Then I heard another crash from inside, and the window behind me burst into flames. I scrambled to the edge of the roof. Below me was a bush, not ideal, but better than solid ground. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and jumped. The fall seemed to last forever, and no time at all. I hit the bush hard, feeling branches scratch my arms and face, but I was out. I rolled onto the grass, gasping for air. From the ground, I could see the full extent of the fire. Flames were pouring out of nearly every window now. The heat was intense, even from where I was lying. I could hear sirens in the distance, but I knew it was too late. There was nothing left to save. I don't know how long I sat there, watching my childhood home burn. Neighbors came out. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. The fire department arrived, but all they could do was contain the blaze and keep it from spreading to other houses. By the time my parents got home, having turned around as soon as they got my text, the house was nothing but a smoldering shell. I tried to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. We stood there, the three of us, staring at the ruins of our life. It was a Thursday night, and I had just gotten home from a long shift at the diner. My feet were killing me, and all I wanted was a hot shower to wash away the smell of grease and coffee. I lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I usually felt safe there. I kicked off my shoes and headed straight for the bathroom, not even bothering to turn on the lights in the rest of the house. The hot water felt amazing on my sore muscles, and I lost track of time as I stood under the spray, letting it wash away the stress of the day. I was just about to turn off the water when I heard my phone ringing. It was muffled, probably still in my purse by the front door where I dropped it. I ignored it, figuring if it was important, they'd leave a message. But then it rang again, almost immediately after the first call ended. Something about that second ring made me uneasy. I quickly rinsed off the last of the soap and turned off the shower. As I reached for my towel, I heard the phone start ringing for a third time. Now I was really starting to worry. I wrapped the towel around myself and hurried out of the bathroom, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood floor. My phone was still ringing when I got to it, and I saw it was my neighbor, Mrs. Kruger. She was a sweet old lady who lived next door, and she never called this late unless it was an emergency. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Oh, thank goodness you answered." Mrs. Kruger sounded frantic. "I've been trying to reach you. I saw someone at your front door a few minutes ago. They were trying to pick the lock." My blood ran cold. I looked at the front door, suddenly aware of how quiet the house was. "Are you sure?" I whispered, as if the intruder might hear me. "Positive," she replied. "I saw them clear as day from my window. They were there for a good 5 minutes before they managed to get the door open. I called the police, but I don't know if they're there yet." I thanked her quickly and hung up, my mind racing. Someone had broken into my house while I was in the shower, and they might still be here. I stood there, dripping wet and shivering, straining my ears for any sound. The house was silent, but that didn't mean anything. They could be waiting, hiding, ready to pounce at any moment. I needed to get out of there, but I was practically naked. My bedroom was down the hall, past the living room and kitchen. If the intruder was still in the house, I'd have to pass through several rooms to get to my clothes and my car keys. I looked around frantically for anything I could use as a weapon. My umbrella was leaning against the wall by the door. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed it, gripping it tightly in my shaking hands. Taking a deep breath, I started to move slowly down the hallway. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I pressed myself against the wall, inching forward, my eyes darting back and forth. As I approached the living room, I saw that things were not as I'd left them. My laptop, which had been on the coffee table, was gone. The drawers of my desk were pulled open, papers scattered on the floor. Someone had definitely been here, searching for valuables. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure anyone in the house would be able to hear it. I considered making a run for the front door, but what if they were waiting outside? And I couldn't exactly run down the street in just a towel. I had to get to my bedroom. I needed my phone charger, some clothes, and my car keys. Then I could get out and call the police from somewhere safe. I made it to the kitchen without incident. But as I was about to step into the short hallway that led to my bedroom, I heard a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of someone moving around in my room. I froze, gripping the umbrella so tight my knuckles turned white. They were still here, in my room, going through my things. For a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then survival instinct kicked in, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stay here in the open. I needed to hide. The kitchen had a small pantry. It was cramped and full of shelves, but it was the only hiding place I could think of. As quietly as I could, I opened the pantry door and squeezed inside, pulling it closed behind me. I stood there in the dark, trying to control my breathing. The smell of spices and canned goods filled my nose as I listened intently for any sound of movement. For what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I heard nothing. Then, footsteps. They were coming down the hallway towards the kitchen. I held my breath, pressing myself back against the shelves, willing myself to become invisible. The footsteps entered the kitchen. They were slow, methodical, as if the person was taking their time to look around. I heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of metal. Were they taking my cutlery? Then the footsteps came closer to the pantry. I raised the umbrella, ready to strike if the door opened. My hand was sweating and I was afraid I might drop it. The footsteps stopped right outside the pantry door. I could see a shadow blocking the sliver of light under the door. They were right there, just inches away from me. I don't know if it was a noise I made, or if they just decided to check everywhere. But suddenly the pantry door started to open. Without thinking, I shoved it outward as hard as I could. There was a satisfying thud and a cry of pain as the door hit the intruder. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I burst out of the pantry, swinging the umbrella wildly. I caught a glimpse of a man in dark clothes, stumbling backwards, his hand to his face where the door had hit him. I didn't stop to get a better look. I ran. I ran through the kitchen, through the living room, not caring about the noise I was making now. I heard the man shout something behind me, but I didn't stop to listen. I reached the front door, fumbled with the lock for a terrifying second, and then I was out. The cool night air hit me as I ran down my front path, still clutching the umbrella, my towel barely staying on. I ran straight to Mrs. Kruger's house, pounding on her door. She opened it quickly, ushering me inside. "The police are on their way," she said, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, unable to speak. We watched from her window as police cars pulled up outside my house, lights flashing. They caught the guy as he was trying to escape through my back door. It turned out he was a local burglar who had been hitting houses in the area. He thought my place was empty because all the lights were off. The police found my laptop and other valuables in his car parked down the street. I gave my statement to the police, borrowed some clothes from Mrs. Kruger, and spent the night at a friend's house. It took a while before I felt safe in my own home again. I always double-check that my doors are locked now. I work late shifts at a call center, so I'm usually up until 2 or 3 in the morning. That night was no different. I was sitting on my couch, watching some random cooking show on TV, trying to wind down after a particularly stressful day at work. My house is pretty old. A small 2-story place I inherited from my grandparents. It's not much, but it's home. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it for the first time. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere above me. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. These old places make all sorts of noises, especially at night. I turned up the volume on the TV a bit and tried to ignore it. But the sound kept coming back. Every few minutes, I'd hear it again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was starting to get on my nerves. I muted the TV and listened carefully. Yep, there it was again. Definitely coming from the attic. I figured it was probably a raccoon or maybe a squirrel that had found its way in. We'd had problems with critters in the neighborhood before. I decided to check it out in the morning. No way was I going up into the attic in the middle of the night to chase out some animal. I unmuted the TV and tried to focus on the show again. But now that I'd noticed the scratching, I couldn't unhear it. It seemed to be getting more frequent, more insistent. I found myself tensing up every time I heard it, waiting for the next scratch. After about an hour of this, I couldn't take it anymore. That raccoon or whatever it was had to go. I couldn't sleep with that noise going on all night. I paused the TV and went to the hall closet to get a flashlight and the broom. If I could just scare it enough, maybe it would find its own way out. The entrance to the attic is in the upstairs hallway, just a trap door in the ceiling with a pull-down ladder. I don't go up there much, just to store Christmas decorations and some old boxes of stuff I never got around to sorting through after my grandparents passed. I pulled the cord to lower the ladder, half expecting some terrified animal to come scrambling down. But nothing happened. The scratching had stopped as soon as I'd pulled the ladder down. Great, I thought. Maybe it had already found a way out. But I figured I should check anyway, just to make sure there wasn't a hole or something where it could get back in. I climbed the ladder slowly, my flashlight in one hand and the broom in the other. The attic was pitch black and smelled musty, like old cardboard and dust. I poked my head up through the trapdoor and shone the flashlight around. At first, everything looked normal. Stacks of boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, the usual attic stuff. But as I swept the beam of light across the room, something caught my eye. There, in the far corner, was a pile of blankets that I didn't recognize. They were bunched up in a way that looked almost like a nest or a bed. My stomach dropped. This wasn't the work of a raccoon. I pulled myself all the way into the attic, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I approached the pile of blankets slowly, still holding the broom out in front of me like some kind of weapon. As I got closer, I started noticing other things. There were food wrappers scattered around, candy bars, chips, crackers, a couple of empty water bottles. Someone had been living up here. I nudged the blankets with the broom handle, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But there was no one there. Just a makeshift bed, a pillow, and something else. Something that made my blood run cold. Poking out from under the pillow was the corner of what looked like a photograph. With shaking hands, I reached down and pulled it out. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw myself. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my bed downstairs. The angle was from above, like someone had been standing over me while I slept. I dropped the photo like it had burned me. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the flashlight. I swung it around wildly, suddenly terrified that whoever had taken that picture was still up here, watching me from some dark corner. But the attic was empty. Just me and the evidence of someone who had been living right above my head for who knows how long. I started noticing more details, each one more terrifying than the last. There was a small mirror propped up against a box, surrounded by hair clippings. My hairbrush was there, the one I thought I'd lost a month ago. And more photos. So many photos. Me watching TV. Me cooking in the kitchen. Me getting the mail. All taken from weird angles like through a window or from the attic vents. This person had been watching my every move. I don't really remember getting out of the attic. One minute I was staring at those photos. The next I was halfway down the stairs, my whole body shaking. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the locks, suddenly sure that whoever had been living in my attic was about to come for me. I made it outside and ran to my neighbor's house. Poor Mrs. Davis probably thought she was being robbed, the way I was pounding on her door at 3 a.m. When she finally answered, I could barely get the words out. I was crying and shaking and probably not making much sense. Bless her heart. She didn't ask questions. She just called the police and sat with me on her porch, holding my hand while we waited for them to arrive. The police searched my house from top to bottom. They found more evidence in the attic. Clothes that didn't belong to me, a laptop, even a small camera. They took fingerprints and collected all the evidence, but they didn't find the person. They think it was probably a homeless person who had been sneaking in and out while I was at work. The attic window was unlocked. I never even knew it could open. That's probably how they were getting in and out. The police put out an alert, but they never found whoever it was. They said I was lucky, that it could have been much worse. But it doesn't feel lucky. It feels like my home isn't mine anymore. I ended up moving out a month later. I've been working from home for about 6 months now. My setup is in the spare room of my house, just a simple desk facing the window that looks out onto the street. That morning started like any other. I got up, made coffee, and sat down at my desk around 8:30 to start my workday. I was in the middle of a video call with my team when my phone buzzed. Glancing at it, I expected to see a delivery notification or something similar. Instead, it was a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message described the shirt I was wearing and made a comment about my eyes. I felt a sudden unease but tried to brush it off as a wrong number or a prank. A few minutes later, another text came through. This one mentioned that my hair looked messy and suggested I should brush it. My unease grew. I looked around the room, suddenly aware that the blinds were open and anyone could see in if they were in the right spot. I got up and closed them, trying to act casual in case someone was watching. Back at my desk, I tried to concentrate on work, but I kept glancing at my phone. For about an hour, there were no more messages, and I started to relax a bit. Then another text arrived. This one asked why I had closed the blinds and said they had enjoyed watching me work. My hands started shaking as I realized this wasn't a prank or a misunderstanding. Someone was actively watching me. I ended the video call abruptly, making an excuse about technical issues. I didn't want my team to see how freaked out I was getting. I got up and started checking all the windows in the house, making sure they were locked. As I moved from room to room, my phone kept buzzing with new messages. The text mentioned details about my house, the new curtains in my bedroom, a family photo on the mantel, even my cat sleeping on the couch. Each message made me feel more exposed and violated. This person didn't just know what I was wearing today, they knew details about my life. I tried to think rationally about who it could be. An obsessed client from work? A neighbor? I couldn't think of anyone who would do this. I decided to test something. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. Within seconds, my phone buzzed again. The new message commented on me being thirsty and mentioned that I had skipped breakfast that morning. That was the final straw. I couldn't take it anymore. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. When the operator answered, I tried to explain the situation without sounding crazy. I told them about the messages, how the person seemed to be able to see inside my house, and how long it had been going on. The operator took my details and assured me they were sending officers right away. They told me to stay on the line and keep away from windows. I huddled in the hallway, away from any possible line of sight from outside. While I waited, another message came through. This one commented on me calling the cops and said we were having such a good time together. I felt sick to my stomach. I relayed the new message to the operator, my voice cracking as I spoke. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 10 minutes, I heard sirens. The operator told me to stay where I was until the police confirmed it was safe. I heard car doors slamming, then voices outside. There was a knock at the door, and a voice identified themselves as police. The operator told me it was okay to answer the door. I got up on shaky legs and made my way to the front door. 2 officers were standing there looking alert. I let them in and showed them the messages on my phone. While one officer was looking at my phone, the other was peering out the windows, scanning the area. Suddenly, the officer at the window tensed up. He quietly told his partner that he had spotted movement in the bushes across the street. They exchanged a look and then told me to stay inside and lock the door behind them. I did as I was told, then watched through the peephole as they crossed the street, moving cautiously towards a cluster of bushes in my neighbor's yard. There was a sudden commotion outside. Shouts, the sound of someone running, then more shouts. I pressed my eye to the peephole, straining to see what was happening. After a minute or two, I saw the officers walking back towards my house. They had someone with them, a man, his hands cuffed behind his back. As they got closer, I felt my knees go weak. It was Anthony, my ex-boyfriend. We'd broken up 6 months ago, right before I started working from home. It hadn't been a bad breakup, or at least, I didn't think it had been. He'd seemed to take it well at the time. I never imagined he would do something like this. When I opened the door, the officers asked if I recognized the man they'd caught. I nodded, still in shock. They explained that they had found him hiding in the bushes with a pair of binoculars and a high-powered camera. He also had a phone with the same number that had been sending me those messages. Anthony wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the ground as the officers read him his rights. They found a small notebook in his pocket, filled with details about my daily routine, when I woke up, when I worked, what I ate. He'd been watching me for months. The officers took my statement and explained that they'd need me to come to the station later to file a formal report. They assured me that Anthony would be held in custody and that I was safe now. As they led him to the police car, Anthony finally looked up at me. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, a mix of anger and something else I couldn't identify. It made me shudder. The officers drove away with Anthony in the back of their car. I stood in my doorway for a long time, staring at the bushes where he'd been hiding. All those months he'd been right there, watching me, recording my every move. And I never knew. I went back inside and locked the door. My phone was still on the table where I'd left it. The last message from Anthony was still on the screen. "You'll regret this." I turned the phone off and sat down on the couch, suddenly exhausted. The police had caught him, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't know if I ever would again. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't concentrate on work. Every little noise made me jump. I kept thinking about how long Anthony had been watching me without my knowledge. I decided to stay with my sister for a while. I packed some clothes and my work computer. As I was leaving, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked down the street. For a moment, I was terrified it might be Anthony somehow, but then I remembered he was in custody. At my sister's house, I tried to get back to some kind of normal routine. I set up my workstation in her guest room and tried to focus on my job. But I kept checking the windows, making sure the curtains were closed. My sister was supportive, but I could tell she was worried about me. A few days later, I had to go to the police station to give a formal statement. The detective showed me the evidence they had found in Anthony's possession. There was the notebook, full of details about my life. What time I usually woke up, what I ate for breakfast, who I talked to on the phone. There were even notes about conversations he had overheard through open windows. But that wasn't all. They found evidence on his computer that he had been planning this for months, ever since our breakup. There were blueprints of my house, schedules of my routines, even plans for hidden cameras he hadn't installed yet. Looking at all of it made me feel sick. The detective explained that Anthony had been charged with stalking and harassment. With all the evidence they had, they were confident he would be convicted. They also helped me file for a restraining order. The legal process was long and draining. I had to attend hearings and give testimonies. Each time I saw Anthony in the courtroom, I felt a mix of anger and fear. He never looked at me directly, always staring straight ahead or at the floor. The trial finally came after a few months. I had to testify, describing the day I received those messages and the months of fear that followed. It was hard to talk about it in front of a room full of strangers, but I knew it was necessary. In the end, Anthony was convicted. The judge sentenced him to prison time with mandatory counseling. The restraining order was made permanent, preventing him from contacting me or coming near my home or workplace, even after his release. Last week, I was working from home like usual. The weather forecast mentioned a storm coming, but I didn't think much of it. We get storms all the time in Florida, so I just went about my day. Around 4 p.m., I noticed the sky getting really dark. The wind picked up, rattling my windows. I closed them and turned on the TV for background noise while I finished up some work emails. The storm hit hard and fast. Rain pounded against the house, and I could hear things hitting the roof. Probably branches or debris. I've always been a bit nervous during bad storms, so I tried to distract myself by making dinner. As I was chopping vegetables, a huge gust of wind made the whole house creak. The lights flickered, and I thought about getting some candles ready just in case. That's when I heard it. A deafening crack, followed by a massive thud that shook the entire house. I dropped the knife I was holding and ducked instinctively. For a second, I couldn't process what had happened. Then I realized a tree must have fallen on the house. I ran to the front door to check outside, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, thinking it was just stuck, but it didn't move at all. That's when panic started to set in. I rushed to the back door, but it was the same story, completely blocked. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call for help. That's when I realized I'd forgotten to charge it earlier, and the battery was dead. I plugged it in, praying it would turn on quickly. But then the lights went out. The power was gone. In the sudden darkness, every sound seemed amplified. The wind howling outside, the creaking of the house, and a new sound, a steady dripping coming from somewhere. I fumbled around for a flashlight, knocking things over in my haste. When I finally got the flashlight working, I started exploring the house, trying to assess the damage. In the living room, I saw a huge branch had punctured the ceiling, letting in rain. Water was pooling on the floor, soaking into the carpet. I moved to the windows, hoping to signal for help, but all I could see was the fallen tree pressed against the glass. It was like being buried alive. As I moved through the house, I kept hearing strange noises. Creaks and groans from the walls and ceiling that I'd never heard before. Each sound made me wonder if another part of the house was about to collapse. I tried to find a safe spot, somewhere away from windows and under a strong doorframe, but nowhere felt secure. Then I heard a new sound, rushing water. It was coming from the basement. I opened the basement door and shone my flashlight down the stairs. The beam reflected off rising water at the bottom. My stomach dropped as I realized the basement was flooding. How long before the water reached the first floor? I spent the night moving from room to room, trying to avoid the areas that seemed most damaged. Every creak and groan of the house made me flinch. I kept thinking about all the stories I'd heard about houses collapsing in storms, people trapped for days. Would anyone even know I was in here? At one point, exhausted and scared, I dozed off for a few minutes. I woke up to a loud crash from another room. In my half-asleep state, I thought someone had broken in. It took me a terrifying few moments to remember my situation and realize it was probably just more debris falling. As the night wore on, I became hyper-aware of every little sound and sensation. The dripping water seemed to get louder. The air felt thick with humidity. I swear I could feel the floor tilting slightly, like the foundation was shifting. Every so often I'd hear a loud crack or pop from somewhere in the walls. Each time I'd freeze, wondering if this was the moment the whole place would come down on me. I tried to distract myself by planning what I'd do when morning came. Surely someone would notice the fallen tree and come to help. But then I remembered. My neighbors on both sides were out of town. Who knew how long it might be before anyone realized I was trapped? As the night dragged on, my mind started playing tricks on me. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept thinking I heard voices or footsteps, only to realize it was just the wind or settling debris. The darkness felt oppressive, closing in around the beam of my flashlight. I don't know exactly when, but at some point, I noticed the storm starting to die down. The wind wasn't howling as loudly, and the rain had slowed to a steady patter. Under normal circumstances, I love the sound of rain. Now it just reminded me of the water slowly filling my basement, inching its way up to where I was. As it got quieter outside, the sounds inside the house seemed to get louder. I could hear water trickling through the walls. The creaking and popping noises were more distinct. Each sound painted a picture in my mind of the house slowly coming apart around me. Just before dawn, I heard a new sound, a faint siren in the distance. My heart leaped. Someone must have called emergency services about the fallen trees. I wanted to shout for help, but I was afraid any loud noise might trigger the house to collapse. The siren got louder, then stopped nearby. I heard car doors slamming, voices shouting. I grabbed a metal pot and spoon from the kitchen and started banging them together, hoping the rescuers would hear me over the sound of the rain and wind. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" a voice called out. I've never been so happy to hear another person. "I'm here, I'm trapped," I shouted back. What followed was a tense hour as the rescue team assessed the situation and figured out how to get me out safely. They were worried that removing the tree might cause the damaged part of the house to collapse entirely. I could hear them discussing strategies, using terms I didn't understand. All I knew was that I wanted out. Finally, they told me they were going to remove a section of wall to create an exit for me. The sound of their equipment was terrifying. Each vibration made me think the whole place would come down. But slowly, I saw a crack of light appear as they created an opening. When they finally pulled me out, my legs were shaking so badly I could hardly stand. The rescuers kept asking if I was hurt, but all I could do was stare at my house. From the outside, I could see how close I'd been to real disaster. The entire front of the house was caved in under the weight of an enormous oak tree. Last Friday, my wife left for a girls' weekend trip, leaving me alone with our dog Max. I was looking forward to a quiet weekend of binge-watching my favorite shows and ordering takeout. The house felt different without her there, but I was used to the occasional solo weekend. Saturday morning, I woke up late and spent most of the day lounging around. By evening, I was settled on the couch with a pizza, ready to start a movie marathon. Max was curled up at my feet, and everything felt normal. About halfway through the second movie, I noticed Max lifting his head, his ears perked up. At first, I didn't think much of it. Max often reacted to squirrels in the yard or cars passing by. But this time was different. He got up and started pacing, looking towards the basement door. I paused the movie and listened, but I couldn't hear anything unusual. I tried to get Max to settle down, offering him treats and petting him, but he wouldn't budge from the basement door. His behavior was starting to make me uneasy. I turned off the TV to listen more closely, and that's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from downstairs. My first thought was that maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow. It wouldn't be the first time we'd had wildlife in the basement. I figured I'd check it out quickly and then get back to my movie. But as I approached the basement door, Max's behavior changed. He started growling, something he rarely did. The scratching sound got louder as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Max's growl turned into aggressive barking, and he positioned himself between me and the door. That's when I started to realize this might not be a simple case of a wild animal. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my hand still outstretched, trying to work up the courage to open the door. The scratching had stopped, but now I could hear soft thuds like someone trying to move quietly. My mouth went dry and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. Finally, I took a deep breath and turned the knob. As I slowly pulled the door open, the hinges creaked loudly in the silence. I flicked on the light switch, illuminating the stairs. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then, movement caught my eye. There, at the bottom of the stairs, was a man. He was crouched by the small window we used for ventilation, which was now broken. Our eyes met, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. I saw the surprise in his eyes turn to panic. In that split second, I realized the danger I was in. I slammed the door shut with all my strength. The sound echoed through the house, followed immediately by a loud thud from the other side. He had lunged for the door, but I had closed it just in time. My hands were shaking as I turned the lock, knowing it wouldn't be enough to keep him in. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing a chair on the way. I wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would buy me some time. Max was barking furiously now, jumping at the door. I could hear the intruder pounding, trying to force it open. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I patted my pockets for my phone, only to realize I had left it on the coffee table. I dashed back to the living room, nearly tripping over Max in the process. As I grabbed my phone, I heard a loud crash from the basement. The chair had fallen. He was trying to break through. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos in my house. I tried to explain what was happening, my words coming out in a jumbled rush. She assured me that police were on their way and told me to find a safe place to hide. I looked around frantically, trying to decide where to go. The front door seemed too exposed, and I was afraid of running into the intruder if I tried to leave. I ended up in the upstairs bathroom, locking the door behind me. Max followed, whining softly now. From my hiding spot, I could hear the intruder moving around downstairs. Glass shattered. He was breaking things, maybe looking for valuables. Every sound made me flinch. I kept imagining him finding me, trapped in this small room with nowhere to run. The operator stayed on the line with me, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. She asked me questions about the layout of my house, how many entrances there were, what the intruder looked like. I answered in whispers, terrified that he might hear me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps on the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. Max started growling again, low and menacing. I pressed myself against the wall, as far from the door as possible. The footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom, I could see a shadow under the door. The doorknob rattled. I bit my lip to keep from making a sound. Max let out a single sharp bark. The shadow moved away and I heard more crashing sounds from the bedroom next door. He was ransacking the house, room by room. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension anymore, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a new wave of fear. What if the intruder panicked? What if he decided he had nothing to lose? The sirens got louder, and I heard tires screeching to a stop outside. There was shouting, then the sound of our front door being forced open. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" The command echoed through the house. More shouting followed, then the sound of a scuffle. I stayed frozen in place, unsure if it was safe to come out. Finally, there was a knock on the bathroom door. "Sir, this is the police. You can come out now. It's safe." I opened the door slowly, my legs weak. 2 officers stood there looking concerned. Behind them, I could see more police downstairs and a man in handcuffs being led out the front door. It was over. The next few hours passed in a blur. I gave my statement to the police, my voice hoarse from the stress. They took photos of the broken window and the damage to the house. An officer explained that the intruder had a history of breaking into homes in the area. He had thought the house was empty for the weekend. As the police finished up their work, one of the officers walked me through the house, explaining how the intruder had gotten in and what I could do to improve my security. Standing in the basement, looking at that broken window, the reality of what had happened finally hit me. I had come face to face with someone who meant to harm me, in my own home. The last police car left around 3 a.m. I locked the door behind them, checking it twice. Max stayed close to my side as I walked through the house, unable to settle down. Every creak and shadow made me jump. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping that night. I called my wife, waking her up to tell her what had happened. She wanted to come home immediately, but I assured her I was okay. As I hung up the phone, I realized that okay wasn't quite true. I was safe, yes, but I didn't feel okay. The sense of security I once had in my own home was shattered, just like that basement window. It was a Tuesday night, and I had just moved into my new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The previous owners had told me it was a safe area, and I felt pretty comfortable already. I remember going to bed around 11 p.m., feeling exhausted from unpacking boxes all day. I had a quick chat with my mom on the phone, telling her about the nice couple that had moved in next door a few days before me. They seemed friendly, waving as they brought in their furniture. I fell asleep quickly, the unfamiliar creaks of the new house fading into the background. I'm not sure how long I was asleep when something woke me up. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The room was dark, but something felt off. You know that feeling when you're not alone? It was like that, but stronger. I lay there, trying to figure out what had disturbed my sleep. That's when I heard it. A soft shuffling sound coming from somewhere in the house. My first thought was that it might be a mouse. The realtor had mentioned the previous owners had dealt with some pest issues. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. These weren't the tiny pitter-patter of mouse feet. These were footsteps. My body tensed up. I live alone, and I knew I had locked all the doors before going to bed. It's always been a habit of mine, double-checking the locks. The footsteps were slow, uneven, like someone stumbling around. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I forgotten to lock a window? Was there a break-in? I wanted to reach for my phone on the nightstand, but I was afraid any movement might alert the intruder to my presence. So I just lay there, barely breathing, straining my ears to track the sounds. The footsteps seemed to be moving around the living room, then into the kitchen. I heard the soft thud of cabinet doors opening and closing. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness by now, and I could make out the shapes of furniture in my room. That's when I saw it, a shadow passing by my open bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone in my house, and they were right outside my room. The shadow paused in the doorway and I could see the outline of a person. It was a man, tall and somewhat stocky. He was wearing what looked like pajamas or sweats. I couldn't make out his face in the darkness, but I could tell he was facing into my room. I shut my eyes tight, hoping that if I couldn't see him, maybe he couldn't see me. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure he must be able to hear it. I was certain that at any moment he would come into the room, and I didn't even want to think about what might happen. But he didn't move. He just stood there, swaying slightly. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, he turned and shuffled away. I heard him bumping into things as he moved through the hallway. A picture frame fell off the wall with a crash, and I flinched, sure that the noise would bring him running back. But the footsteps continued, slow and unsteady. I heard him in the spare bedroom, opening and closing drawers. Then he was in the bathroom, and I heard water running briefly. All this time, I hadn't moved a muscle. I was torn between the urge to leap up and run out of the house and the paralyzing fear that kept me rooted to the bed. The intruder made his way back down the hallway, passing my bedroom door again. This time, he didn't stop. I heard him going down the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. Part of me hoped he was leaving, but another part was terrified about what he might do downstairs. I had left my laptop on the coffee table. Would he steal it? Would he find something to use as a weapon and come back upstairs? I lay there, listening intently, trying to interpret every sound. I heard more cabinets opening in the kitchen, the fridge door, the sound of liquid being poured. Was he helping himself to a drink? The absurdity of the situation almost made me want to laugh, but the fear kept that impulse in check. After what seemed like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes, I heard the front door open. The cool night air drifted up the stairs, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Then the door closed and everything was quiet. I stayed frozen in place, unsure if it was really over. My mind kept playing tricks on me, interpreting every little house noise as the intruder coming back. It took me nearly an hour to work up the courage to move. My muscles were stiff from being so tense for so long. Slowly, carefully, I got out of bed. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep under my bed. I'd never used it for protection before, but I was glad to have it now. I crept down the hallway, checking each room. Everything was in disarray. Drawers were open, clothes were strewn about, but nothing seemed to be missing. Downstairs, I found more of the same. The kitchen was a mess, with an open carton of orange juice on the counter and a half-empty glass in the sink. But my laptop was still on the coffee table and my wallet was untouched on the entry table. I went to the front door, and that's when I saw it. The deadbolt was unlocked. I always lock that deadbolt. But in the stress of moving, had I forgotten? I locked it immediately, then checked all the windows. They were all secure. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, bat in hand, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally came up, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Somehow the daylight made everything seem less threatening. I decided to talk to my neighbors to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. That's when I met Anna, who lived next door. When I described what had happened, her face went pale. "Oh my God," she said. "I am so sorry. That must have been my husband, Andrew." I was confused. Why would her husband break into my house? But then she explained. Andrew had a severe sleep disorder. He was a sleepwalker, and sometimes he would leave the house in his sleep. They had just moved to the neighborhood and were still getting used to the new layout. In his sleep, Andrew must have thought he was entering his own home. Anna was mortified, apologizing profusely. She explained that they usually had alarms on their doors to wake them if Andrew tried to leave, but they hadn't set them up in the new house yet. She promised they would get them installed immediately. I was relieved to have an explanation, but it didn't entirely erase the fear I'd felt. Anna invited Andrew over to apologize in person once she told him what had happened. He was deeply embarrassed and swore it would never happen again. I was video chatting with Jake about a week ago. It was just after dinner, maybe around 8:30 p.m. I remember because I had just finished cleaning up the kitchen and decided to head upstairs for our usual call. My bedroom's on the second floor, and I've got this desk set up facing the wall with the window behind me. It's a big window that looks out over the backyard and this huge old oak tree. I sat down at my desk and opened up my laptop. Jake's face popped up on the screen and we started chatting like we always do. He was telling me about his day at work and I was kind of half listening, just nodding along and making the right noises at the right times. I was pretty tired from a long day at the office. As Jake was talking, I noticed his eyes kept darting to something behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just distracted by something on his end of the call. But then he stopped talking mid-sentence. His face changed. He went really pale and his eyes got wide. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer right away. He just stared at something behind me. Then he said, "Don't move. There's someone at your window." For a second, I didn't understand what he meant. My window's on the second floor. There's no way someone could be there, right? But Jake looked scared, really scared. I felt myself go still, not wanting to turn around. "What do you mean?" I asked him, trying to keep my voice low. Jake swallowed hard before he answered. "There's a face," he said, "pressed against the glass. They're looking right at you." I didn't want to believe him. I mean, it had to be a joke or something, right? But Jake's not the type to joke around like that. I could feel my heart beating faster. The room suddenly felt colder. "What should I do?" I whispered. Jake told me to get up slowly and leave the room. He said not to turn around, just to go. I nodded and started to push my chair back. That's when I heard it, this soft tapping sound on the glass behind me. I froze. The tapping came again, louder this time. I could see Jake on the screen, and he looked terrified. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't think. I just moved. I jumped up from my chair and ran for the door. As I was running, I heard a loud thud behind me like something had hit the window. I didn't look back. I just grabbed the doorknob and yanked the door open. I ran down the hallway, my feet slipping a bit on the hardwood floor. I could hear something behind me, but I didn't know if it was real or just my imagination. I got to the stairs and practically flew down them. I was holding onto the banister to keep from falling. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I ran straight for the front door. My hands were shaking so much I could barely unlock it. Finally, I got it open and ran outside. I didn't stop until I was out in the street. Only then did I turn back to look at the house. My bedroom window was dark. I couldn't see anything moving. The street was quiet, just the sound of crickets and a dog barking somewhere in the distance. I stood there for a while, not sure what to do. I didn't have my phone. I'd left it on my desk. I was just standing there in my pajamas, barefoot on the cold asphalt. After a few minutes, I saw headlights coming down the street. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Jansen, coming home. She saw me standing there and stopped her car. She asked me if everything was okay. I must have looked pretty bad because she didn't wait for an answer before she was out of her car and walking towards me. I tried to explain what happened, but it all came out in a rush. I'm not sure if I was making much sense. Mrs. Jansen listened, then she called the police. She let me sit in her car while we waited for them to arrive. The police got there pretty quickly. 2 officers went into the house to check it out while another one stayed with me and Mrs. Jansen. They asked me a bunch of questions. Had I seen anyone suspicious around lately? Had I heard any strange noises before the incident? That sort of thing. After what felt like forever, the officers came back out. They said they'd checked the whole house and there was no sign of anyone. They'd looked at the window too, but there were no marks or anything to suggest someone had been there. One of the officers went next door to talk to my other neighbors, see if anyone had seen anything unusual. The other one walked around the outside of the house with a flashlight. They were looking at the ground under my window, but I couldn't see if they found anything. I was still sitting in Mrs. Jansen's car trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? But no, Jake had seen it too. I remembered I'd left the video call running on my laptop. I wondered if Jake had called someone when I ran out. The officers came back and said they couldn't find any evidence of an intruder. They asked if I wanted to go back inside, but I couldn't. The thought of going back into that house made me feel sick. Mrs. Jansen offered to let me stay with her for the night, and I gratefully accepted. Before we left, one of the officers went back into my house to get my phone for me. When he brought it out, I saw I had a bunch of missed calls and messages from Jake. I called him back right away. Jake was freaking out. He'd been trying to reach me ever since I ran out of the room. He told me that after I left, he saw a shadow move across the room. Then the call cut out. He'd been calling and texting nonstop since then. I tried to explain what had happened about the police not finding anything. Jake insisted on what he'd seen. He described it: a pale face, pressed right up against the glass. He said it had been staring right at me, not moving, barely blinking. The police said they'd keep an eye on the house for the next few days, but there wasn't much else they could do without any evidence. They took my statement and said they'd be in touch if they found anything. The next day, I went back to my house with Mrs. Jansen. Everything looked normal in the daylight. My laptop was still on my desk where I'd left it. The window was closed and locked, with no signs that anyone had been there. I got hit with a nasty flu last month. You know the kind: fever, chills, body aches, the works. I live alone in this old house I inherited from my grandparents, so I was pretty much on my own to deal with it. I'd been in bed for 2 days straight, barely able to keep down water and some crackers. On the third day, I woke up feeling like I was in a fog. My head was pounding, and I was drenched in sweat. I remember checking my phone. It was around 2 p.m. I'd slept through most of the day. I tried to sit up, but the room started spinning, so I just lay there staring at the ceiling. That's when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a whiff of something off. I figured it was just my nose playing tricks on me. When you're sick, everything smells and tastes weird, right? I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the smell got stronger. It was sharp, kind of like rotten eggs. Even through my stuffed-up nose, it was impossible to ignore. I knew I should get up and check it out, but my body felt like it was made of lead. Every time I tried to move, waves of nausea washed over me. I must have dozed off again because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a throbbing headache. The smell was even stronger now. It hit me then. Gas. It smelled like gas. My foggy brain started to clear a bit as adrenaline kicked in. I knew I had to get up, had to check it out. Getting out of bed was a struggle. My legs were shaky, and I had to hold onto the wall to stay upright. The room tilted and swayed around me. I made it to the bedroom door and had to stop, leaning against the door frame, trying to catch my breath. It felt like I'd run a marathon just crossing the room. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. I shuffled along, one hand on the wall to keep my balance. The smell got stronger with every step. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was breathing through my mouth, trying not to gag. Going down the stairs was terrifying. My vision was blurry, and I couldn't tell if it was from the fever or the gas. I had to take each step one at a time, both hands gripping the railing. About halfway down, I had to stop. My head was spinning so bad I was afraid I'd fall. I sat down on the step, trying to clear my head. That's when I heard it. A faint hissing sound coming from the kitchen. It was barely audible over the ringing in my ears, but it was there. I knew I had to keep going. I forced myself to stand up, gripping the railing so tight my knuckles turned white. I finally made it to the bottom of the stairs. The kitchen was just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. The hissing was louder now, and the smell was overwhelming. I stumbled into the kitchen, my eyes watering from the gas. It took me a moment to spot the problem. The old gas stove my grandparents had installed decades ago was the culprit. One of the burners was slightly open, letting out a steady stream of gas. I reached for the knob to turn it off, but my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't grip it properly. After a few tries, I managed to turn the knob. The hissing stopped, but the smell was still strong. I knew the house was full of gas. Even in my feverish state, I understood how dangerous this was. One spark, and the whole place could go up. I needed to open the windows, get some fresh air in. But first, I had to get to the circuit breaker and cut the power. Any electrical spark could set off the gas. The breaker box was in the basement, down another flight of stairs. Getting to the basement door felt like walking through quicksand. Each step was a battle against dizziness and nausea. I fumbled with the door handle, my sweaty hand slipping off the knob a couple of times before I got it open. The basement stairs loomed before me, dark and steep. I took a deep breath, instantly regretting it as the gas-filled air made me cough. Holding on to both railings, I started down. About halfway, my foot slipped. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to fall. Somehow I managed to catch myself, but the sudden movement sent a spike of pain through my head. I finally reached the breaker box. In the dim light, the labels were hard to read. I squinted, trying to make out the words. After what felt like an eternity, I found the main switch and flipped it off. The house went silent as all the electronics powered down. Now I had to get back upstairs and open the windows. The trip back up the basement stairs was even worse than going down. By the time I reached the top, I was gasping for breath. The gas smell seemed even stronger now. I staggered from window to window, struggling with each latch. Some of them stuck, requiring more strength than I had to open them, but I kept at it, knowing it was my only chance. As each window opened, a blast of cold, fresh air hit me. It helped clear my head a little, but also made me realize how close I'd come to disaster. After opening all the downstairs windows, I knew I had to do the upstairs too. The thought of climbing those stairs again made me want to cry, but I didn't have a choice. I dragged myself up, step by agonizing step. By the time I reached the top, my legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand. I went from room to room, throwing open every window I could. The crisp winter air rushed in, creating a draft that started to push out the gas-filled air. But it also chilled me to the bone. I was still in my sweat-soaked pajamas, and now I was shivering uncontrollably. With all the windows open, I knew I should get out of the house. But I was exhausted. The adrenaline that had kept me going was wearing off, and the full force of my illness hit me again. I started making my way back downstairs, planning to go out the front door. I never made it. Halfway down the stairs, the world started to go dark around the edges. I felt myself falling, but I couldn't do anything to stop it. The last thing I remember is a sense of falling, then nothing. I woke up in the hospital. Turns out my neighbor had seen me collapse on the front lawn. I must have made it outside before passing out, but I have no memory of it. The doctor said I was lucky. Between the flu and the gas exposure, it could have been much worse. They kept me in the hospital for a few days, monitoring my oxygen levels and making sure there was no lasting damage from the gas. The whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to not waking up at all. When I finally got home, the gas company had already been there. They'd replaced my old stove with a new one. They told me the old one had a faulty valve that had worn out over time. Last summer, we had this brutal heat wave. I mean, it was hot like I've never felt before. The kind of heat that makes you feel like you're walking through soup every time you step outside. I live in this small house on the edge of town, and usually it's pretty quiet around here. But during that heat wave, it was like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. My air conditioning had been acting up for a few days. It would work for a bit, then sputter out, leaving me sweating and miserable. I kept thinking I'd get it fixed, but you know how it is. You always think you have more time. Well, on this particular day, it finally gave up the ghost completely. Just stopped working, right in the middle of the hottest part of the afternoon. I tried everything I could think of to get it going again. Checked the thermostat, fiddled with the breaker box, even gave the unit outside a good kick. Nothing worked. By this point, I was dripping with sweat and feeling pretty desperate. The house was like an oven, and I couldn't take it anymore. So I decided to open all the windows. I figured maybe I could get a cross breeze going or something. Anything to make it feel less like I was slowly baking alive. I went around the house, pushing up every window I could. The hot air rushed in, but at least it was moving air, you know? After that, I was exhausted. The heat just sucks the life right out of you. I decided to try and take a nap, maybe sleep through the worst part of the day and wake up when it was cooler. I grabbed a thin sheet, couldn't stand anything heavier, and sprawled out on my bed. The ceiling fan was going full blast, but it wasn't doing much more than pushing the hot air around. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was waking up feeling groggy and disoriented. You know that feeling when you nap during the day, and you're not sure what time it is or even what day it is? It was like that, but worse. The room was dim, like it was getting towards evening, but something felt off. That's when I heard it. This soft scraping sound coming from the direction of my window. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of it. I thought maybe it was a tree branch or something, but then I remembered. I don't have any trees that close to the house. I turned my head towards the window, and that's when I saw him. There was a man, halfway through my window. One leg was already inside, and he was pulling himself through. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like my brain just couldn't process it. The man saw me looking at him, and he stopped moving. For a second, we just stared at each other. I could see the sweat on his face, the way his shirt was sticking to him. He looked as surprised to see me as I was to see him. Then he started talking, real fast. Said something about how he was just checking to make sure I was okay, that he'd been worried because of the heat, and he hadn't seen anyone around. But even as he was saying this, his eyes were darting around my room. I saw him looking at my laptop on the desk, the watch on my nightstand. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there and let this guy come into my house, but I was scared. What if he had a weapon? What if there were more people outside? My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I remembered my old baseball bat. I keep it under my bed, have ever since I moved in here. I'd never thought I'd actually need to use it, but now I was glad I had it. I started to slowly move my hand towards the edge of the bed, trying not to make any sudden movements. The guy was still talking, still trying to convince me he was just being a good neighbor. But I could see in his eyes that he knew I wasn't buying it. His voice got a little more urgent, a little less friendly. I managed to get my fingers on the bat. The feel of the smooth wood was reassuring. I gripped it tight, and then in one quick motion I sat up and swung the bat up onto the bed. I didn't point it at him or anything, just held it there where he could see it. "Get out," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, kind of high and shaky. But I meant it. I was scared, yeah, but I was also angry. This was my home, and this guy was trying to rob me. The man's eyes widened when he saw the bat. He put his hands up like he was surrendering, but he didn't move back out the window. He started talking again, faster this time, saying how this was all a misunderstanding, how he didn't mean any harm. I cut him off. I said, "Get out. Now. Or I'm calling the police." I reached for my phone with my free hand, never taking my eyes off him. That seemed to do it. He started backing out of the window, real slow. I stood up, still holding the bat. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to stand steady. I wasn't about to let him see how scared I was. It felt like it took forever for him to get out of that window. Every second, I was terrified he was going to change his mind and try to rush me. But finally, he was out. I rushed to the window and slammed it shut, locking it. I ran through the house, closing and locking every window. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the locks. Every shadow made me jump. I kept expecting to see the man's face at another window, or to hear him trying to break in. When I got to the front door, I realized it had been unlocked this whole time. The thought made me feel sick. I locked it, then shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Then I called the police. I was still holding the bat while I talked to them. I couldn't seem to let it go. I told them what happened, and they said they'd send someone right away. But those minutes waiting for them to arrive were some of the longest of my life. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see the man. But the street was empty. It was like the whole thing had been some kind of heat-induced hallucination. But I knew it wasn't. It had been real. When the police finally got there, they took my statement and looked around the house. They found some scuff marks on the outside wall under my window, where the guy had climbed up. Seeing those marks made it all feel real again. This had really happened. Someone had really tried to break into my home. The police said they'd keep an eye on the area, but I didn't feel very reassured. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me sit up in bed, clutching that baseball bat. I kept replaying the whole thing in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. It was a Friday night and I was settling in for my usual horror movie marathon. I live alone in this old 2-story house on the outskirts of town. It's usually pretty quiet around here, which is perfect for getting immersed in scary movies. I'd just gotten home from work, grabbed some leftovers from the fridge and headed to the living room. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the windows. I pulled the curtains closed, wanting to create that perfect dark atmosphere for the movie. I scrolled through my watch list, trying to decide what to watch. I settled on this new release everyone had been talking about, something about a haunted house and a family being terrorized by ghosts. You know, the usual stuff. As the movie started, I got comfortable on the couch. The opening scene was pretty intense. Lots of creepy noises and jump scares. I could feel myself getting tense, gripping my soda can a little too tight. But that's why I watch these movies, right? For that adrenaline rush. About 20 minutes in, there was this scene where the main character was exploring a dark basement. The music was building up and you just knew something was about to jump out. That's when it happened. Right as the ghost was about to appear, my lights went out. For a second, I thought it was part of the movie. Like maybe they'd done something fancy with smart home integration or whatever. But then I realized my TV was off too. The whole house was pitch black. I sat there for a moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust. The sudden silence was deafening. I could hear my own breathing loud and quick. I fumbled for my phone, using it as a flashlight to navigate to the kitchen where I keep my circuit breaker. As I was checking the breaker, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps, coming from upstairs. At first, I thought maybe it was just the house settling. Old houses make weird noises all the time, right? But then I heard it again. Distinct footsteps, like someone walking across the upstairs hallway. My mind started racing. I live alone. There shouldn't be anyone upstairs. I stood there, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, moving from one room to another. This wasn't the house settling. Someone was up there. I felt my stomach drop. My palms were sweaty, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of there, but the front door was on the other side of the house. I'd have to pass the stairs to get to it. I decided to hide. It wasn't brave, but it felt like the safest option. I crept to the hallway closet, trying to move as quietly as possible. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I managed to get into the closet, closing the door as softly as I could. I wedged myself between some coats and an old vacuum cleaner, trying to make myself as small as possible. The darkness was complete. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. From upstairs, I could still hear movement. Drawers opening and closing, footsteps moving from room to room. My mind was going wild, imagining what might be happening up there. I realized I needed to call for help. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. The screen seemed blindingly bright in the dark closet. I dialed 911, praying that whoever was upstairs wouldn't hear me. When the operator answered, I whispered as quietly as I could. I tried to explain the situation, but I was so scared I could barely get the words out. The operator kept telling me to speak up, but I was terrified of making any noise. Finally, I managed to give them my address and explain that someone had broken in. The operator told me to stay hidden and that police were on their way. Those next few minutes felt like hours. I sat there in the dark, listening to every little sound. The footsteps upstairs had stopped, but that almost made it worse. Where were they now? Were they coming downstairs? Then I heard a new sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, unsteady footsteps. They were coming down. I held my breath, pressing myself further back into the closet. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and started moving through the house. They were getting closer to my hiding spot. I could hear them in the hallway now, right outside the closet door. I was sure whoever it was could hear my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right in front of the closet. I thought this was it. They were going to find me. I was trying to think of what I could use as a weapon, maybe the vacuum cleaner, when I heard sirens in the distance. The footsteps in the hall started moving again, faster now, heading towards the back of the house. The sirens got louder, and I heard car doors slamming outside. Then voices shouting, "Police! Open up!" I heard the front door being forced open. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness under the closet door. I was so relieved I almost cried. I burst out of the closet, probably scaring the officers half to death. I started babbling, trying to explain what had happened, and that the intruder was still in the house. The police searched the house, and that's when things took a really unexpected turn. They found someone all right, but it wasn't a burglar. It was my elderly neighbor, Mr. Harrington. He was in the kitchen, looking confused and scared. Turns out Mr. Harrington has dementia. He'd wandered out of his house and somehow got into mine through the back door, which I'd forgotten to lock. In his confused state, he thought he was in his own home. He'd been wandering around upstairs, probably looking for his bedroom. The police called Mr. Harrington's daughter to come get him. While we were waiting, I sat with him in the kitchen. The poor guy was so disoriented. He kept asking where his wife was, even though she'd passed away years ago. When Mr. Harrington's daughter arrived, she was horrified. She apologized over and over, explaining that he'd never wandered off like this before. She'd been in the shower when he slipped out, and she'd been frantically searching the neighborhood for him. The police took some statements, and then everyone left. Just like that, it was over. I didn't finish my movie that night. Couldn't bring myself to watch anything scary for a long time after that. Real life, it turns out, can be a lot scarier than anything Hollywood can come up with. I was doing laundry in the basement of our house. It was a Saturday afternoon and my roommate was out for the day. I'd been putting off this chore all week, but my pile of dirty clothes had finally reached critical mass. So there I was, sorting through socks and t-shirts, trying to get it all done as quickly as possible. Our basement isn't exactly the coziest place. It's all concrete and exposed pipes, with this musty smell that never quite goes away. The washing machine is old and loud, rattling like it's about to take off every time it hits the spin cycle. But it gets the job done, so we've never bothered to replace it. I just loaded up the machine with my darks and was measuring out the detergent when I heard something. At first I thought it was just the washer making one of its weird noises. But then I realized it was coming from upstairs. It sounded like our front door opening and closing. I figured it must be my roommate, Mark. Maybe he'd forgotten something and come back early. I called out, "Hey Mark, I'm doing laundry, need anything washed?" There was no answer. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me over the noise of the washing machine, so I yelled a bit louder. Still nothing. Something about the silence felt off. I can't really explain it, but it was like the air in the house had changed. I decided to go up and check. I turned off the washing machine. I didn't want to leave it running if I was going upstairs anyway. As I started up the basement stairs, I could hear movement in the living room. It didn't sound like Mark. The footsteps were heavier, and there was this shuffling noise like someone was moving things around. I got to the top of the stairs and peered around the corner into the living room. What I saw made me freeze. There was a man in our living room, and it definitely wasn't Mark. This guy was taller, bulkier, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was going through our stuff, picking things up and shoving them into a backpack. Our laptop, Mark's gaming console, even the little jar where we keep spare change, all of it was disappearing into his bag. I stood there, not daring to move. The guy hadn't seen me. He was totally focused on what he was doing, muttering to himself as he moved around the room. I could see the side of his face now. He had this scruffy beard and a scar running along his jaw. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront him? Try to scare him off? But what if he had a weapon? I'm not exactly a fighter, and this guy looked like he could easily overpower me. Then I remembered the back door. If I could just get to it without him noticing, I could get out and get help. But to reach it, I'd have to go back down the basement stairs and through the laundry room. Any noise could alert him to my presence. I started to back down the stairs, keeping my eyes on the living room. Each step felt like it took an eternity. The old wood creaked under my feet, and I was sure the sound would give me away. But the burglar kept rummaging through our things, oblivious to my presence. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The concrete floor of the basement felt cold under my bare feet as I crept towards the back door. I had to maneuver around the piles of laundry and the rumbling washing machine. I reached for the doorknob, praying it wouldn't squeak. It turned smoothly, and I eased the door open just enough to slip through. The sunlight outside was blinding after the dimness of the basement. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes as I stepped out onto the back porch. Our backyard isn't very big, just a small patch of grass with a fence separating us from the neighbors. I could see Mrs. Johnson's house next door. She's this sweet old lady who's always bringing us cookies. In that moment, her house looked like the safest place in the world. I ran across the yard, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept expecting to hear the burglar shouting, to realize I'd been spotted, but there was nothing except the sound of my feet on the grass and my own ragged breathing. I reached Mrs. Johnson's back door and started pounding on it. "Mrs. Johnson," I called out, trying to keep my voice down but also desperate for her to hear me. "Mrs. Johnson, please, I need help." After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, I heard movement inside. The door opened, and there was Mrs. Johnson, looking confused and a bit alarmed. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked. I started talking, the words tumbling out so fast I'm not sure how much sense I was making. I told her about the burglar, about how I'd been in the basement and how I needed to call the police. She ushered me inside, locking the door behind us. Mrs. Johnson's house smelled like cinnamon and old books. Any other time it would have been comforting. But right then, all I could think about was the man in my house, wondering if he'd realized yet that someone had been home. Mrs. Johnson handed me her phone, her hands shaking a little. I dialed 911, trying to calm my breathing enough to speak clearly. When the operator answered, I explained the situation as best I could. They told me to stay where I was, that they were sending officers right away. The wait for the police felt endless. Mrs. Johnson and I stood by her front window, watching my house. Everything looked normal from the outside. No lights on, no movement visible through the windows. It was surreal to think that inside, a stranger was going through our belongings. Finally, we saw the police cars pull up, their lights flashing but sirens off. 2 officers got out and approached my house cautiously. A third came to Mrs. Johnson's door to talk to us. I explained again what had happened, pointing out where I'd last seen the burglar. The officer radioed this information to his colleagues. Then we waited. It wasn't like in the movies. There was no dramatic showdown, no shouting or sounds of a struggle. After a few tense minutes, we saw the officers leading someone out in handcuffs. It was the man I'd seen in our living room. He looked smaller somehow, less threatening in the daylight with police officers on either side of him. One of the officers came over to take my statement. He explained that they'd caught the guy trying to sneak out through a window. Apparently he'd heard them coming and panicked. They'd recovered most of our stuff, though some things were damaged. When it was finally safe to go back to my house, I felt strange walking through the front door. Everything looked different somehow. Our possessions were scattered around, drawers left open, cushions askew. It was like looking at a familiar picture that someone had subtly altered. The police stayed for a while, taking photos and asking questions. They said the guy was known to them, that he'd been involved in other burglaries in the area. They praised me for not confronting him, for getting out safely and calling for help. After they left, I just stood in the living room, not sure what to do. The washing machine was still full of my half-washed clothes. The laundry detergent was still sitting open on the dryer. It all seemed so normal, so at odds with what had just happened. I called Mark, my hands shaking as I dialed. When he answered, I tried to explain what had happened, but I found myself struggling to find the words. How do you tell someone something like this? Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.